Hello, my name is Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire, Frisbee for the children, sure.
And we're having another Conversations. We've been discussing storytelling and world mythology. You've been going from one mythology to another. I've decided to travel across the world geographically. So last time we did basically Babylonian mythology, which is the mythology of ancient Iran, or ancient Iraq rather. Sorry, Iran. So that was Babylonian mythology. Now we're talking about Persian mythology. Now Persia is ancient Iraq. So geographically it's located close together, but they're very different countries. Since they've been at war off and on for like several decades in modern times. Babylon, Iran had the advantage of having the Tigris and the Euphrates. They had two good rivers.
Right.
They couldn't always depend on them, but they had them at least. Iraq has less resources than that.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, Persia became a mighty empire that influenced the world for well over 1,000 years. It's a home to a whole host of religions, many of which were incredibly influential on the rest of the world, even though almost no one knows about them.
Interesting.
Yeah, the Persian mythology and everything from that part of the world, for whatever reason, has never caught on in the Western world. I may get to some reasons why before the end of this, but let's jump right into it. It is the home of the very first monotheistic religion in the world. We call it Zoroastrianism, although people who worship it call it Mazdayana. It's named after Zoroaster, who was the prophet of their religion, who's also known as Zarathustra. It is a religion that's around 4,000 years old. So this religion is being invented at roughly the same time that the Gilgamesh stories were happening, or being told at least.
So is he seen as their god?
No, he's a prophet. He's the one who brought the word of God to the people.
So who do they consider god?
Well, I'll get to that. It is the oldest religion of the world that is still being practiced. So this is the very first time in these conversations I can say things that will insult people who are actually active in their religion. Prior to now, I've been pretty safe. But I can actually insult real human beings in the world right now if I say the wrong thing. There's only about 200,000 Zoroastrianisms left.
So if you put that in perspective to other religions,
That's really small.
but what would very large be?
Millions. And there's 200,000 of them. There's 14,000 living in America, which is a pretty small number considering. That's like demographically that's barely a dot. When I first heard of Zoroastrianism as a kid, I really hoped they worshiped Zorro, the swashbuckling hero of old California, but sadly that was not the case. That is completely inaccurate. The religion is dying out for a couple of reasons. First of all, they were driven out of their homeland by Islam, which happened in like the 6th century. Their religion doesn't allow conversions. So no matter how cool you think Zoroastrianism is, if you're not born into one of those families, you can never convert.
Wow.
And they also don't allow any outside marriages. You have to marry someone else in that faith, which is increasingly difficult as there are less and less of them in the world. It is considered a dying religion. People doubt it will last more than a couple of hundred years, despite having been around already for 4,000 years.
Well, that's kind of the argument. It's survived this long. That's
Exactly.
impressive.
Well, it's very impressive. Now, Zoroastrianism was the chief religion of 3 major empires, which ruled that part of the world for off and on for like 1,000 years. The earliest one is called the Persian Empire, recall. It has several other names. They were famous as being the bad guys in the 300 movies, in which they were portrayed really horribly.
This is Sparta.
Yeah, I know. Xerxes, the Persian king, we actually know what he looks like because he carved pictures of himself in every city that he conquered, and he conquered a lot of them. So he wasn't a 7-foot-tall androgynous guy wearing only gold chains. He was actually a big burly guy with a beard.
Oh.
But Frank Miller has a little problem with homophobia sometimes. So the Persians are all meant to look really weird and grotesque in the film as opposed to those manly men, the Spartans. But that's a whole other story. The Persians were eventually defeated by Alexander the Great. Their city was burned, but they were replaced by the Parthian Empire, which was also Zoroastrianism, so the religion survived that. And there also was another empire called the Sanassarian Empire, which was ruled for even longer after that. They were eventually wiped out in the 6th century by Islam. Now, the priests of Zoroaster in the ancient times were called magi,
Okay.
a name that will probably sound familiar to you.
Right.
For one thing, it's the word that we get both magician and magnet come from that base word.
Yep.
And there are, of course, the 3 wise men of Bible fame who were the magi from the east who followed a star.
So it's
These were Zoroastrian priests coming.
wow.
Yeah. So they have a certain history to them. They have a real reputation. In the 6th century, they were replaced by Islam. It was still being worshipped in isolated communities all across the Middle East. But eventually, they emigrated to India, where they're known as the Parsi people, because Parsi is the Indian word for Persian.
Okay.
And they have a thriving community in India. They've also immigrated from there around the world. The most famous Zoroastrian that you've heard of is Freddy Mercury of Queen fame.
Mhm.
So there you go. You do know someone who was Zoroastrian. So his family says his religion was very important to him. So Zoroaster was the prophet, also known as Zarathustra, if you're Greek. He had a vision from Ahura Mazda.
Oh, who?
Ahura Mazda. He is the wise lord of all creation. He is omnipotent, omniscient, he's all-powerful, he's everywhere at once. He's the god of all good things. He's the god of rainbows and sunlight and puppies. He is literally incapable of being evil. But all is not right with the world, of course, because he is eternally opposed by Angira Mainyu. Now, Angira Mainyu is the god of evil. He's responsible for everything bad in the world. Angira Mainyu is sickness and death and destruction and darkness and so forth and so on. Angira Mainyu is also known as Ahriman in some translations.
Okay.
Each of them have several names. Zoroastrianism posits an eternal battle between good and evil. They're constantly fighting each other. And you keep evil in check by doing good. So charity and doing good deeds is very important to the Zoroastrian community.
Okay.
They're famous for their charity. And each of them has like minions under him. There are lesser immortals that serve Ahura Mazda, and there are evil things that serve Angira Mainyu. And sometimes these are considered to be like saints or archangels. And oddly enough, many of them resemble the gods that were worshipped before Zoroastrianism came along, because Iraq has a long history of polytheism.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the other gods that had been worshipped already for centuries got swept up into this religion and are considered technically a part of it now.
Okay.
So one of the chief evil minions was known as Zahak or Dahak. I first encountered that name watching Xena many years ago.
The warrior princess?
Yes, Xena the warrior princess. She fought Dahak as well.
Did she?
Yes, Dahak was the evil incarnate on that show. He was a major enemy for an entire season. And I remember looking him up because I thought, that's a really oddly specific name to call a random demon that she's fighting. And so I discovered it did in fact come from the Zoroastrian religion. He was a god of evil, and they chose him to be their evil god because, technically Xena, although it will probably upset you to discover, Xena was not historically accurate. However, it did come before Christianity had come along. And so the idea of Satan hadn't actually been formed in Xena's world.
Okay.
So Dahak became the Satan of Xena's continuity. He is the ultimate force of evil. He's described often as being a huge, dark-skinned creature that has snakes growing out of his shoulders.
That could be useful, I suppose.
Yeah. Interestingly, in Persian mythology, there was also a good god who served Ahura Mazda, who was known as Mitra or Mithras. And he would go on to have a long career outside of Persia.
That name sounds familiar.
Well, Mithraism became a religion all by itself,
Oh.
separate from Zoroastrianism.
Huh.
For a long time, people have assumed that the two religions are related to each other, that mythicism was a type of Zoroastrianism, but now archaeologists and anthropologists are saying that's probably not true. They can't find any actual link between the two of them, except Roman soldiers fighting the Persians picked up the name somewhere and kept it. But mythicism seemed to be a totally separate religion from Zoroastrianism, so I'm not going to go into it that much. It was hugely popular. It was also a monotheistic religion. It was the next best religion to Christianity for a while in Rome. And it was a real toss-up as to which would win out in the end. Christianity won out finally. The mythicism was a real contender for a long time. Now the whole thing of a god of good and a force of evil who are eternally at war, and one side is served by angels and one side is served by demons, probably sounds kind of familiar to you.
I'd have to say it does.
Yeah. Most experts believe that all the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, took a lot of their ideas from Zoroastrianism. It was the root of all of those things. So while it itself is gradually dwindling, the things that sprang from it are still going strong.
So you mentioned that one of the qualities of these people is that they, I guess they had a sense of karma, what goes around, they did
Well,
good deeds.
They had a sense, one of the things they had was the idea that you would be judged in the afterlife. And if you did good things, Huramazu would take you up to heaven. If you did bad things, then Angaramanyu would take you down into hell.
Okay. So that was a major component of their belief
Yeah.
system. What were some of the other beliefs that they had?
That's basically it. The whole thing of the eternal struggle between good and evil was the crux of their entire religion.
Oh, okay.
That's what it was based on. So you were compelled to do good if you were Zoroastrian.
So I suppose that would be parallel to Catholicism in the sense that if you do something bad, if you will, then if you do enough good things, it balances it.
Yeah. The world was a mixture of good and evil to Zoroastrians. Animals that were useful and helpful, like dogs and horses, were considered good, and there were agents of Ahura Mazda. But things like snakes and scorpions that didn't serve any useful purpose and could kill you, those served Angaramanyu.
Do we know now, do scorpions serve a purpose in the food chain or whatever it might be?
They kill bugs. Snakes can eat rats, which could be very useful, but cats also eat rats and they're cuter. So,
Well, I suppose snakes can survive in environments that cats can't.
Yeah, they believe the world is a mixture of good and evil, and that's why we have to constantly do good to counteract evil that's always in the world around us. So it'll never really go away. There is a cycle of stories in which it all comes to an end at some point.
Do they believe that they themselves were good?
Yes, but you're always tempted. Free will was really important to them.
Right.
You always have free will. And again, some kinds of Christianity also stress that a lot.
Right.
There's even a version of their creation myth in which the world was originally a flat, featureless plain, and then evil came along and ripped up part of it to make mountains and dug out chunks of it to make oceans and things like that. So theoretically, the whole world was created by evil, which is why there'll always be some evil in the world.
Okay.
A mountain can be beautiful to look at, but can also have a landslide that crushes you and kills you.
Right.
So is a mountain good or evil? It's both. So that's the philosophical conundrum that the Zoroastrians lived with. Persian mythology is very cool. Now, Zoroastrianism, the people of Iraq are a very ancient people. They have a long history of poetry and song and storytelling and so forth. So it's not surprising there were hundreds of stories that come out of Zoroastrianism. And most of them have been collected into this book, which is the Shamanah, which is the Book of Kings. This details the history of ancient Iraq from its founding several thousand years ago to the 6th century when they were defeated by Islam. It's a super long book. I won't pretend that I've read it. I've only read parts of it. Unfortunately, it's a really tough slog in English. This is the You know, the Odyssey, the Iliad, this is their idols of the king, this is the history of their people, the mythological history of their people. But for whatever reason, it doesn't work very well in English. The great hero was Rostam, or Rustum. He was their Hercules, their Cuchulainn. There's a whole cycle of stories where he goes on different quests, defeats a lot of monsters. His magic weapon was his mace. When he was a child, he killed a rampaging white elephant by hurling his mace at its skull, and that was his favorite weapon. And these are all interesting stories, but they're all really dry. Either the ancient language that it was written in doesn't translate very well to English, or it's never been translated well. Things like the story of Gilgamesh or the Odyssey get retranslated back into English constantly. There's a new edition of the Odyssey every couple of years or so. It's been many years since this story was translated into English. And a lot of it is beautifully written, but from a storytelling point of view, you know, you look through trying to find the beginning, middle, and end, the follow-through of the story, and it's just not there. All the accounts of the monsters that Rustum killed are very clear-cut and dry. He went into a mountain and fought a dragon and defeated him. Then Rustum got on his horse and went, you know, and it's like, you can add stuff that to make it better, but if you keep adding enough stuff, you're losing the thrust of the story.
Mm-hmm.
The thrust of it was him doing a series of good deeds. The great tragedy of his life was that he wound up accidentally killing his own son in battle, which has happened to a couple of mythological heroes. Yes, he was in another country where he was captured, and the princess of that country fell in love with him, but she could find no man who was her equal in her own land.
Or
Rostam. Rostam was captured, and the princess of that country fell in love with him because there was no one in her country that was her equal. And so she agreed to release him if he would spend the night with her, which of course he did, being a great hero of mythology. So naturally she got pregnant, and he said that if you have like a boy, put this like armband around him so I'll know him when I see him again. But she of course dutifully does. But later their two countries go to war. And the son winds up going to battle without knowing, he knows his father's name, but not what his father looks like. And he winds up wearing a suit of armor that covers the armband. And so only after he's slain him does he chop the armor off and see the armband and realize he's killed his own son.
Rough.
Heroes do have it rough sometimes. It's almost always an element of tragedy in them.
They really do.
Yeah. The stories of Rostam are great. When you search for things online, if you search for things on YouTube, half the Rostam videos aren't even in English because there's so little demand for these stories in English. I think there's material there for storytellers, but there's no demand for it. There's no audience. Possibly because Iraq today we see in such a bad light because of current politics. You know, ancient Persia, of course, was a very different place with very different ideals. Again, it's looking at another world through the focus of different people's eyes. The Zoroastrian religion has had a big impact on the world. Again, probably in ways that you never noticed. One of the YouTube videos I found said that Ahura Mazda was the god of like all things good in the world and compact Japanese cars, because the company in Japan named themselves Mazda after Ahura Mazda. They thought it would bring them luck.
Okay.
Yep. Also, George R.R. Martin cribbed pretty heavily from Zoroastrian religion for a lot of Game of Thrones, because he knew he could steal that mythology and most people in America wouldn't notice it.
I have yet to watch Game of Thrones. Not a single episode yet.
It's quite a story. It's long.
I've been told.
I read the first book before seeing the show, and it has a cast of characters in the front, and I had to keep flipping back to like actually remember who everyone was. The cast of characters is so huge, but anyway, that's a topic for another time.
Right.
So we'll continue on our mythological journey across the world next time. Until then, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you next time. Until then, be safe. Bye.